Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their advice. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On last week's episode, I was talking about the importance of stories that come from all different types of identities, rather it be age, ethnicity, gender, religion, or different types of experiences. When I learn about a story based on an experience that I'm unfamiliar with, then I'm immediately inclined to want to learn more about it. This week's episode is definitely one of those stories, as I welcome Kayley Whalen to Autism Stories to discuss the neurodivergent experience in the goth scene. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Kayley, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start out like I do on each of these episodes of Autism Story and learn, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
So in 2016, a transgender man named Caden Clark was murdered by police on a suicide crisis call. And this event really got a lot of people in the autistic community and transgender community talking about the intersections between being autistic and being trans. And I came out as trans in 2006. I've known I was neurodivergent since about that same time, maybe more like 2004. But this was the first kind of big conversation I ever took part in, and big movement advocacy event I took part in was something that was called #TransAutisticPride. And there was a joint statement released condemning the police murder of Caden Clark and talking about how often autistic people are told that we're not the experts on our own lives, and that, like, Caden Clark had been told, like, oh, you're not trans, you can't, like, by a therapist, doctor, medical professionals, oh, you have to cure your autism first before we'll treat you for being transgender, which is ridiculous. You don't cure autism, it's part of who we are. So kind of being part of that #AutisticTransPride campaign was like my entry into autistic advocacy and autistic community. And I was working at the National LGBTQ Task Force at the time.
I learned recently that you were writing about something that I thought was, I was very excited to learn about, something I haven't seen written about before. And that is you're writing an essay with research about neurodivergence in the goth scene. What made you decide to want to work on this?
So I saw a letter distributed by my friend Lydia Brown from a disability studies professor that was collecting an anthology of essays called Heavy Metal Music and Disability, Crips, Crowds, and Cacophony. And I initially saw this and I was like, wow, that sounds really cool. Too bad I'm not more into heavy metal. And then I read the description and I was like, wait a second. I listen to tons of gothic metal and death metal and doom metal. It doesn't require that like metal be like the primary part of what you listen to, because I consider myself goth. So where goth music overlaps with metal, that's kind of where I feel I have a place. And my last concert before COVID was actually a heavy metal concert in Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon. So this was an exciting opportunity, because for most of my life, I didn't know the term neurodivergent. I didn't really have neurodiversity community or autistic community. Really, like I said, I got to know autistic advocates in like 2016. But I always had felt like the goth community was a place where people could talk about depression, bipolar, things that made you different from the rest of the world were somewhat celebrated and accepted in the goth subculture and in the collection of on this, I also included like heavy metal and punk and like Renaissance festival subcultures where they overlapped with goth. So people who like identify very primarily with being punk, but like very much participated in like kind of overlap with goth subculture, they counted. Just like I identify strongly with punk and metal and like Renaissance festival stuff, but primarily identify with goth, I feel like there's a huge overlap.
Now, as part of the research, you created a goth neurodiversity community survey. What type of information were you trying to learn about the survey?
A lot of it was qualitative. It was a supplement to one-on-one interviews that I did with people to learn about their stories and why the goth subculture was important to them, and also if they were autistic or if they had other neurodivergent conditions. Very commonly, people had bipolar, ADHD, depression, but a whole slew of different things: sensory processing disorder, hyperlexia, dyslexia, all sorts of things were included. So one of the most fascinating things about the data collection, now a lot of people know that there's larger percentage of people in the autistic and neurodivergent communities who are transgender and or LGBTQ than people who are non-autistic, non-neurodivergent, allistic, as we say. And also, a lot of people know that the goth scene has a lot of LGBTQ people and is kind of a very gender fluid, LGBT accepting, I'd say bisexual accepting place. I don't see many like cis gay men there, but I see a lot of gender fluidity and other identities, including other trans and non-binary people such as myself. So the surprising yet not surprising part of this data collection is that like around 80% of the people who replied were not straight. Technically, 77% of the people who answered were straight, and it was also they could choose more than one. So it was interesting to see just how queer this sample was, because I didn't just sample LGBT people. And then even more fascinating, like almost none of the people who answered the survey were cisgender. Like 70% of the people who answered were transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, femme, butch, queer, genderqueer, and very few identified as cismen. I had all of them, I want to say 2 cisgender men answer the survey, which was fascinating. There's just a lot of queerness in the neurodivergent community, a lot of LGBT and queerness in the goth community. When you combine the two, oh my God, that's almost everyone's LGBT.
Was there anything else really surprising? Because I maybe wouldn't have guessed it was that high, but not super surprised by that. Was there anything in the one-on-one interviews or through the survey that really jumped out at you?
One of my goals that I had in the data collection was to tell the survey of multiply marginalized, neurodivergent, and goth folks. So I really prioritized doing one-on-one interviews with BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, and Latinx people who may or may not identify as BIPOC. I'm Latinx and multiracial. So I get very tired of kind of this idea that the goth scene is just a white subculture. I had so many people of color tell me during the interviews, oh my God, I got so sick of being the one Black person that people knew was goth, or I got sick of going to a club and going to a non-goth space and people didn't understand why I dressed like this, didn't understand why I didn't like hip hop or reggaeton. And God, it was really hard being a Latinx or Black or goth. I actually know a lot of Asian Pacific Islander goths. I was living in Vietnam for some time and a part of the goth scene there. So actually I found it was less atypical for Asian Pacific Islander folks to identify with goth for various reasons. But that said, I interviewed people who were second generation Goths, who had like a black father or like two black parents who were like second generation Black Goth. And I had second generation Latin American Goths. And it was interesting because those people had very unique stories. Because for those who didn't have like people of color in their immediate family who were Goth, they often felt, oh my God, I'm the only black person in the Goth club. But for people who had parents who were BIPOC and Goth, they were like, oh, I always felt like you could be BIPOC and Goth. I never felt like there was a kind of crisis of identity there. And likewise, I wanted to oversample for BIPOC people because not enough autistic and neurodivergent people of color get highlighted and profiled and talked about. And unfortunately, as my friend Lydia X.C. Brown, who I know you interviewed, has infamously said, like, the disability movement is as white as Antarctica. I just really didn't want to tell disability stories from just people who were white. So I had a really fun time getting to know all these different kind of cultural things. Like, I feel weird being Latinx and being Goth sometimes. Why don't you like, Latin music? Why don't you dance like a Latin girl? Why do you wear this pale thing? Yeah. And also pale makeup's kind of a whole other, like, thing. People have this weird stereotype of, like, Goths wearing white pancake makeup. And they're like, oh, it's a white subculture. People wear white makeup. And I'm like, people wear makeup that, like, makes them feel like ghastly or ghoulish, or I hate to say this, but also like kind of like sickly. Anyone with any skin color can do that. Like, I've seen so many black and POC Goths who have fascinating makeup that's clearly recognizable as Goth, and it's not all about white face. I just really hate that stereotype too.
It's interesting you bring that up. I really know nothing about the history of the BIPOC Goth culture experience. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Part of my research is I really went into Black, Goth, and post-punk history. There's been a lot of representation that's been invisible in punk and post-punk. Now, X-Ray Specs isn't a Goth band, but they have a big influence on what later became Goth, and their lead singer was Black and one of the more famous in the punk scene. But, like, a lot of people know about She Wants Revenge. There's always been people of color in the goth scene. They're just often invisible, like many movements. The LGBT movement, for example, we forget that there were people of color involved in the very beginning. There's a ton of post-punk bands. I was in Thailand and Vietnam. I've seen goth and post-punk and metal, bands who are, Asian Pacific Islander, locals. And one of my favorite people who I interviewed for this is my Vietnamese tutor and friend who I met at a drag fashion show in Saigon. And she was pretty much single-handedly responsible for bringing goth fashion to Vietnam. And she formed a fashion design company because a lot of Vietnamese people were like, oh, Vietnamese people, our temperature, our climate, our skin color, our culture, goth doesn't really work well for that. You can't be goth in Vietnamese, and she heard this all the time. And so she decided to design Vietnamese clothes for Vietnamese people that were goth and also J-rock, Visual Kei inspired. Visual Kei has its own identity as birthing Gothic Lolita out of kind of rock bands in Japan. So there's really goth all around the world. Mexico City has El Real, which is a very famous goth club. Hocico is a very famous band that came out of Mexico and was one of my first introductions to the goth scene. So there's really goth culture all over the world, including a lot of people of color.
Now, I think a lot about people being more like who they are and who they're truly meant to be all the time, being kind of trying to be our authentic selves. I'm just wondering, how do you see the goth scene as helping people in this area as a result to better advocate for to be their authentic selves?
Oh my God, this is such a great question, because I think this is one of the defining characteristics of the goth subculture and why it is so welcoming. There's some caveats, which I'll discuss, but by and large, far more welcoming to neurodivergent people than mainstream culture and most subcultures for that matter. I've dabbled in all sorts of subcultures. I think goth, from its very beginning, ironically, some of the earliest goth music was called positive punk because it dealt with emotions and more than just anger. It was called positive because it was like processing more difficult things. It's kind of like a silly label and it didn't stick for good reason. But goth's always had like a very emotional edge. There's always kind of been explorations of madness. I mean, She's Lost Control by Joy Division would be kind of a foundational post-punk song that set the stage for a lot of goths. Plunge into insanity and madness. I mean, it's really a double-edged sword because goth subculture really kind of celebrates like madness. Like we all love like the Mad Hatter and the Cheshire Cat and like, you know, the quote like we're all mad here. So many goths have like shirts that say something like that. You know, I have a million Cheshire Cat and Alice in Wonderland like decorations and things. I went to Burning Man and like my entire tent was decorated Alice in Wonderland theme. I've always considered my first time I went to a goth club in like 2002 was like going down the rabbit hole, and I never like came back after descending into the madness that is the goth scene. So more recently, in kind of like more in Europe and the UK, you've actually had movements called Mad Pride, which are similar to the disability pride and neurodiversity pride movements here. But like, I think goths were doing Mad Pride for a very long time before it became seen as a political movement, because goths talk about depression. Our music's often about depression. Our music is about not fitting social norms. And what is more about not fitting social norms than being autistic? I mean, that's a defining characteristic of autism is we're awkward. We don't like social norms. We don't like small talk. Bauhaus, which is often considered the first goth band because its 1979 single "Bela Lugosi's Dead," has a song called "Small Talk Stinks." Like, what is more like autistic than like a song called "Small Talk Stinks"? So these themes of like, so I'm ranting, right? And I'm autistic, and many people consider this like a special interest. And that's one of the defining characteristics of goth subculture is goths tend to be super devoted. Like, we carry that identity into almost every aspect of our lives. I mean, right now, I'm wearing black eyeliner, all black, you know, dark lipstick. I don't wear this every day, but I feel more comfortable as myself wearing black. It's part of my identity. It's part of my special interest, but in the goth scene, it doesn't matter if you're autistic or whatever. The more you know about goth, the more welcomed you are, the more excited and like energized by the goth subculture you are. Like, you get cred. Like, the more you can talk about goth, the more cred you get in the scene. And what's more accepting for autistic people than a subculture that values people who can info dump about goth? Because that's what goth people generally can do. Because we have to explain our subculture to everyone, you know?
Because it's not understood by so many?
Yeah, and it's the butt of like a million jokes, you know? It's easy to parody, but to live it every day and to have it be a formational part of your identity, yeah, I mean, goths make fun of goths too. Like, Voltaire, the singer Aurelio Voltaire, has a whole book, like, What is Goth? Which is parodies of goth subculture. But it's kind parodies from, like, the love we have, but so many, like, I really hate, like, goth kids get made fun of. They get made fun of on YouTube by cringe culture, which is like, cringe culture is like this awful internet phenomenon where people watch videos of like kids and autistic people and trans people who might have special interests and they make fun of them. Like, it's so easy to like be like, oh God, that goth makeup, like, why is that person wearing those clothes? That's so weird. Let's record a video making fun of them. Like, that stuff is really toxic. And, like, goth is really against that kind of thing. We don't like making fun of each other for having weird, esoteric special interests, you know, or hyperfixations, or whatever term you might want to use. You know, we don't just have autistic people, but we all love goth. So making fun of people for being excited about a subculture that gives them validity, is kind of, unproductive and mean.
Yeah. Now, your essay about neurodivergence in the goth scene will be published in a disability studies anthology. Can you talk a little bit about this anthology?
Yeah, so it's called Cricks, Crowds, and Cacophony, Heavy Metal Music and Disability. It's still in the editing stage, so everyone involved in the project is disabled. We have, changed the deadlines and publishing dates multiple times. One of the editors had health issues and had to drop. So I don't have a publication date or a lot more details about the other authors yet, but I'm happy to provide updates. The main thing I can talk about is the fact that the scholars who have worked on it have written about queerness in heavy metal subculture, and they've written about dark folk music and other musical subcultures that overlap with goth quite a bit. I was actually hesitant to send something at first because I don't really primarily identify with the heavy metal scene. I'm an old school trad romantic goth, traditional / romantic goth, and I only got into metal more recently, but I'm excited they accepted my essay despite that, and maybe about a quarter of the music I discussed in my essay is heavy metal related, but there's always been inspirations going back to Black Sabbath and the goth scene, and more recently gothic metal becoming a genre with bands like Paradise Lost has been Nightwish, very famous metal band that many goths love. Many people who I interviewed love Nightwish. I love Nightwish. One of the heavy metal bands that I absolutely had to include, and when I interviewed people, so many people brought up this band. Their name is Delane, and they're a heavy metal band that recorded a song called We Are the Others. And We Are the Others is kind of an ode to goth and heavy metal and freaks who aren't accepted by society. And it includes talking about the way we think. In a music video, there are neurodivergent people holding up signs I'm ADHD. I think someone said Asperger's. They didn't use the term autistic, but also this is an older video, 2012, when Asperger's was still a condition. But the reason this music video and this band is so important is also this song was a tribute to a goth who was murdered because of being a freak. I hesitate to say anti-goth hatred. It's a little different than bias-related crimes such as being a person of color. There's been a lot of debates, including the Sophie Lancaster Foundation. Sophie Lancaster was the person who was murdered. That Sophie Lancaster Foundation tries to pass hate crimes laws to make goth covered hate crimes class, and they've succeeded in some areas in the UK. But as a racial justice advocate, I don't really like hate crimes laws. They expand the police and prison system. I don't really believe being goth is the same as being racially profiled. But the murder of Sophie Lancaster was specifically because she was a freak, a weirdo, probably neurodivergent, an other. She was othered by society, and her boyfriend was nearly murdered with her for no reason other than hate. And she was called all sorts of awful names, and the song is an ode to all the people who are other, and it includes race and disability, in the song itself. So that's, if I could say where heavy metal and disability intersect, Sophie Lancaster and We Are the Others in Delane is a perfect example of kind of the heavy metal community's awareness that disability is part of and overlapping with the heavy metal scene.
Now, something else that you've done recently is you've relaunched your YouTube channel focusing on travel. And your most recent video is regarding travel tips for trans and non-binary folks. What are some things for trans and non-binary folks to consider when they're traveling to another country like you do?
Yeah, so I'm in Guatemala City now. I've traveled the world solo for over 14 months, and I have a blog called Trans World View about traveling the world and interviewing trans and non-binary people around the world. So I started this series of tips videos to help other autistic, neurodivergent, and trans people to feel safe traveling. And from my very first tips video, I have given advice about how to research like LGBTQ acceptance in different countries. In the video you're referring to, talked about how to kind of go through very gender binary and invalidating screenings at airports and border crossings, and how so often trans people are face really awful things while they're getting screened at like TSA and such. So I talked about tips to like stay safe and kind of know your rights at airports. And then the interesting thing is, just before we did this interview, I actually dropped another video. So now I have 4 videos, hopefully 5 or 6 in the series by the time this is aired, because I try to drop one a week. And the recent one was on autistic travel tips, food, and staying healthy while traveling. That's another big thing for autistic folks. We often have difficulty with dietary restrictions, allergies, celiac disease, lactose insensitivity, and this is all about staying healthy while traveling. So all my tips are aimed at helping neurodivergent and LGBTQIA people like myself travel, covering everything from, airports to accommodations, LGBT rights laws, neurodivergent communities in other countries. So we're meant to be a resource at youtube.com/Kayley Whalen. So it's KAYLEYWHALEN. That's my name on the episode. Yeah, youtube.com/Kayley Whalen. So, yeah.
Well, thanks for the new video. I'll have something to do after we talk.
Yes, you're welcome.
Before we go, is there anything that you'd like to talk about that I haven't mentioned, haven't asked you about?
Yeah, so one of the things, in addition to like kind of profiling the goth community and specifically people of color and neurodivergent people within the goth community, is the essay also explored the music itself and the cultural touchstones, as I say in the essay, that point to neurodivergence having always been part of the goth scene. And one of the most interesting cultural touchstones I talked about is something called the changeling. Yeah, you're nodding your head, you know what that is. A lot of autistic people know what changelings are, because for hundreds, if not thousands of years, autistic developmentally disabled people, the belief was that we had been swapped at birth or swapped like a few years after birth with like a fairy child, often by like a mischievous, like dark, the term might be unseelie fairy. That means the kind of disorderly, chaotic trickster fairies. So autistic people for a long time were like, oh, you're not a real child. Like, you're just a fairy child who shapeshifted into my child, or you're actually a piece of tree that was like shapeshifted to look like a child. And there are several goth songs, including a band called The Changeling. So there's songs by the band Changelings. There's a heavy metal band called Changeling. But I specifically looked at 4 different songs about changelings and some poetry and books, and how goth subculture explores this really dark myth of the changeling. As many autistic people might know, there is a problem with autistic children being murdered by their parents, often seen as an undue burden, a parasite, that they are, sucking away the life of the mother and father. And that is a holdover from the changeling mythology, that many autistic and developmentally disabled children were murdered by parents who were like, oh, they're just a parasitic dark fairy who's sapping all our resources and eating all our food. That's why one of the most common aspects of the changeling myth is they're like ravenously hungry, is like that they justified murdering autistic children because they were like eating food that could have gone to a different child. So it's a very dark myth. And if there's one thing that goth is very good at, it's exploring very dark mythology. And so while many people think about vampires and werewolves and how goth kind of makes anti-heroes out of like the, noble vampire, like, the Lestat figure. There's not that much awareness that, like, goth has always, like, loved changeling mythology. There's even a goth role-playing game called The World of Darkness, Changeling the Dreaming. And so I really explored changelings, and I had a ton of fun exploring changeling myths in my stories. The one metal band that I've profiled is a band called Alcest, and they have an album translated into English as it's in French, is The Voyage of the Soul, and it very much follows a changeling mythology of, like, the changeling, like, trying to find their soul in another realm because they've been separated from this fairy realm at birth, and they're trying to find their origin story and find who they really are because they know their soul is not a human soul, and it's venturing into this dark, whispering woods and hearing the call of nature and the fairy folk and journeying there. It's called Voyages of the Soul, Journey of the Soul, depending how you translate it, by Alcest. So it was fascinating in translation, analyzing the entire album and how it follows common changeling mythology. Although the word changeling is not used, the lead singer has talked quite a bit about how they relate to fairy mythology and often feel like they're an alien in this world, that they're some otherworldly being who happens to be forced into the human world. I don't know if they're neurodivergent or not. My guess is yes. But I very much enjoyed analyzing this particular metal band, which many people would consider to be very gothic, if not technically gothic metal. So it's Alcest, Alcest, and I cannot pronounce French, but I'm not even going to say it. But Voyages of the Soul is the English translation. Yeah.
Just hearing you talk is making me think, in so many walks of life, it's difficult for a lot of times for autistic or neurodivergent folks to kind of be openly autistic or neurodivergent. I'm wondering with, in terms of goth culture, do you see much of a difference there?
I definitely think goths are much more open about being neurodivergent. I think autism is having kind of a much more visible presence now. I think for a lot of us who came into the goth scene in the late 90s and early 2000s, autism just wasn't really as well understood. But we all just knew we didn't fit in. We didn't like social norms. We didn't fit in with mainstream subculture. We knew our brains worked a different way. And one of the ways to express being neurodivergent and be proud of being neurodivergent was to be goth and talk about, anxiety, depression, symptoms of autism, even if we didn't know we were autistic. Now, for people who came into the goth scene in like the last 10 years, when autism and neurodiversity has become much more commonly understood, now those people often entered the goth scene knowing already they were autistic, or there's a lot of like Tumblr goths, like the social media platform, not as popular now, but a lot of people found the goth and autistic communities through Tumblr, and I had so many people, like the newer generation, maybe like one generation younger than me, they're like, yeah, like goth and autism were like so interlinked in the community I was part of. We all talked about it, and it was like very open. And that wasn't my experience, but I came into the goth scene in like 2001, I started hearing like goth music maybe in the late 90s, and we just didn't. Neurodiversity had been used in an essay by then, but there wasn't really an organized neurodiversity movement or disability justice movements that talked about, autistic self-advocacy, and there weren't groups like the Autistic Women on Binary Network, and there weren't, outspoken people at the time like Lydia X.C. Brown and Mel Baggs who like really defined the kind of recent neurodiversity movement. Now, Lydia X.C. Brown, I keep mentioning their name. They were actually one of the people I interviewed. And they were actually one of the people who brought up the song We Are the Others by Delaine, as did several others. Shane Newmeyer I interviewed, who's a famous neurodivergent advocate and has worked on the Stop the Shock, Judge Roddenberry Center protests. I interviewed a lot of people working in disability justice. Nome Lam, who is the creative director at Sins Invalid, which is a disability justice BIPOC LGBT-led group. I interviewed folks that were just doing autistic advocacy on their own. And like I said, I really prioritized telling stories of groups and individuals who were people of color, and tried to get away from telling the story of like the whites as Antarctica, like founders of the neurodiversity and, the white founding fathers myth. I tried to look beyond that. I tried to look at POC Goths and POC neurodivergent people, and trans, very important talk about trans, that get away from cis white men seen as founders of autism advocacy in the goth scene. I mean, we all worship Peter Murphy. Well, not all of us. A lot of us love Peter Murphy, very famous goth. But I wanted to look at people other than white men like Peter Murphy when I looked at the music that I analyzed. So.
Well, Kayley, it's always interesting talking with you, and I always learn so much. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh my God, I have one more thing I had to add. There is a song called Ship on Fire, and it's by a black-fronted black metal band. And this was an amazing story, like a historical fiction story that one of the Goths I interviewed educated me about, that there is this just amazing story of a Confederate naval, basically an assistant on a ship was a slave who hijacked a Confederate ship. And so Zeal and Ardor, this black metal band that's black fronted, wrote several albums from an African American perspective and a slavery history perspective. So I wanted to name specifically a black fronted black metal, extremely gothic song. So yeah, check out Ship on Fire by Zeal and Ardor. It's amazing. So yeah.
You definitely gave people enough music to listen that they can look up and learn from. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks so much to Kayley for the conversation. To learn more about Kayley, check out the link in the podcast description of this episode. If you would like to learn beyond this podcast how Autism Personal Coach can coach you to reduce your daily overwhelm and get the things you want in your life, then book a Zoom call with me today. A link to book the call can be found in the podcast description of this episode. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable experience as you, it would very much be appreciated. On next week's episode of Autism Stories, we will discuss coaching for the autistic community. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.